In just 45 seconds, one of Britain's most beloved chat shows descended into absolute chaos. What started as light banter between Graham Norton and comedy legend Ricky Gervais exploded into a fiery shouting match that left audiences stunned, cameras shaking, and one of the guests storming off set in disgust. This wasn't just awkward television. This was a complete meltdown broadcast to millions. Before we dive into what happened, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We bring you daily videos exposing Britain's darkest scandals, the confrontations they don't want you to see, and the moments that get buried by the media. Hit that subscribe button now. Last night's episode of The Graham Norton Show was supposed to be a celebration. Ricky Gervais was there promoting his latest Netflix special, sitting on that famous red couch alongside a couple of other celebrities who were mostly there to laugh and sip wine. The studio audience was packed, the atmosphere was buzzing, and everything seemed normal. Graham opened with his usual charm, that cheeky smile and Irish wit that's made him a household name for decades. "So, Ricky," Graham began, leaning forward with his cue cards, "you've built your entire career on saying things that make people uncomfortable. Do you ever worry you've gone too far?" It seemed like a softball question, the kind Ricky fields a dozen times a week. He laughed, that distinctive cackle that's become his trademark, and settled back into the couch. "Gone too far?" Ricky repeated, shaking his head. "Graham, comedy is about pushing boundaries. If everyone's comfortable, you're not doing your job. You're just telling people what they want to hear, and that's not comedy. That's propaganda." The audience clapped. A few people cheered. This was classic Ricky, and everyone expected Graham to volley back with something witty. But instead, Graham's expression shifted. His smile tightened. "Right, but there's a difference between pushing boundaries and just being cruel, isn't there?" Graham said, his tone noticeably cooler. "Some of your recent material, Ricky, it feels less like comedy and more like punching down." The studio went quiet. You could feel the temperature drop. Ricky's smile faded slightly, and he sat up straighter on the couch. "Punching down?" Ricky said slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "Who exactly am I punching down at, Graham? Because last time I checked, I go after the powerful, the hypocrites, the people who pretend to be saints while doing dodgy things behind closed doors." Graham waved his hand dismissively, and that gesture, that casual wave, it was like lighting a fuse. "Oh, come on, Ricky. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Your jokes about trans people, your constant attacks on activists, your obsession with winding up people who are just trying to live their lives. It's not brave, it's just mean." The other guests on the couch suddenly looked very uncomfortable. One of them, a young actress, stared down at her lap. The other, a musician, glanced toward the exit. But Ricky didn't back down. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice had an edge to it. "Mean?" Ricky said, his eyes locked on Graham. "You want to talk about mean? How about the mean-spirited bullying that happens when comedians get mobbed online for telling jokes? How about the mean censorship that happens when people with power decide what's acceptable to laugh at?" "I don't punch down, Graham. I punch in every direction. And if that bothers you, maybe you should ask yourself why." Graham's face flushed. He shifted in his chair, and for a moment it looked like he might laugh it off, move to the next topic, keep things light. But he didn't. "You know what, Ricky? I've had you on this show multiple times. I've laughed at your jokes. I've defended you when people said you'd gone too far. But sitting here now, listening to you, I'm starting to think they were right." The audience gasped. Actual gasps rippled through the studio. This wasn't banter anymore. This was personal. Ricky leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and stared at Graham with an intensity that made everyone watching lean in. "So, you're saying you regret having me on?" Ricky asked quietly. "You're saying you wish you'd censored me, kept me off your precious show?" "I'm saying maybe it's time we stop giving platforms to people who use their fame to hurt vulnerable communities." Graham shot back, his voice rising. "You hide behind free speech and comedy, but what you're really doing is validating hate." That word, hate. It hung in the air like smoke. Ricky stood up from the couch. Not quickly, not in a rage, but slowly, deliberately. The camera zoomed in on his face, and you could see the anger there, controlled but boiling just beneath the surface. "Validating hate," Ricky repeated almost to himself. "Graham, do you even hear yourself? I've spent my entire career fighting for the underdog, calling out hypocrisy, defending free expression. And you, sitting in your comfortable chair, on your comfortable show, you think you get to lecture me about what's acceptable? Graham stood up too, which almost never happens on his show. The host doesn't stand during interviews. But there he was, on his feet, pointing a finger at Ricky. Yes, I do get to lecture you, because this is my show, and I'm tired of watching people like you use comedy as an excuse to be cruel. You don't get a free pass just because you make people laugh. People like me? Ricky's voice went quiet again. Dangerously quiet. What does that mean, Graham? People who don't toe the line? People who won't bend the knee to whatever the current trend is? You used to be funny, mate. You used to be willing to take risks. Now you're just another celebrity terrified of saying the wrong thing. The insult landed hard. Graham's face went red, properly red, and he took a step toward Ricky. Don't you dare question my integrity, Graham hissed. I've built this show on respect, on making people feel welcome, on creating a space where everyone can be themselves. And then you come on here and poison it with your toxic bullshit. The swear word shocked everyone. Graham Norton doesn't swear on air. He's the polished, professional host who keeps everything smooth. But there it was, on live television, and the studio audience didn't know whether to gasp or cheer. Ricky laughed, but it wasn't his usual laugh. It was bitter. Toxic bullshit? Is that what we're calling jokes now? Graham, you've spent years kissing up to Hollywood celebrities, letting them promote their films with zero pushback. You don't ask hard questions. You don't challenge anyone. You just sit there and nod and laugh at their rehearsed stories. And you want to lecture me about integrity? Graham's hands were shaking. You could see it on camera, the way his fingers trembled as he pointed at Ricky. Get off my stage, Graham said, his voice low but clear. I mean it, Ricky. Get off my stage. Ricky spread his arms wide, that familiar gesture he does when he's making a point. There it is, the tolerant, inclusive Graham Norton, kicking someone off for disagreeing with him. This is what it's come to. You don't want conversation. You don't want debate. You just want everyone to agree with you. And if they don't, you silence them. You're not being silenced, Graham shouted, properly shouted now, his voice cracking. You have Netflix specials. You have millions of followers. You have more platforms than almost anyone in this country. Stop pretending you're some victim. I never said I was a victim, Ricky replied, his voice steady. But I'm not going to pretend that what you're doing right now isn't exactly what I've been warning about. You're trying to shame me into silence because you don't like what I say. That's not tolerance, Graham. That's tyranny. The other guests on the couch looked absolutely frozen. The young actress had tears in her eyes. The musician was staring at the floor. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay silent, so they did nothing, creating this eerie vacuum of sound. Graham walked closer to Ricky, close enough that they were almost face to face. The cameras caught every second of it. You want to know what I really think? Graham said, his voice shaking with emotion. I think you've lost your way. I think you used to be brilliant, genuinely brilliant, and now you're just angry. You're angry at a world that's changing, at people who are demanding to be treated with basic respect, and instead of growing with it, you're digging in your heels and calling it principle. Ricky didn't flinch. He stood there, looking Graham in the eye, and when he spoke, his voice was ice cold. And I think you've sold out. I think you're so desperate to be loved, so terrified of being canceled, that you've forgotten what it means to have a spine. You don't stand for anything anymore, Graham. You just stand wherever the wind blows. That was it. That was the moment it all fell apart completely. Graham's face twisted, and for a second it looked like he might actually push Ricky. His hands came up, not quite shoving but close, and security guards who'd been standing off camera suddenly moved forward. Get him out! Graham yelled, his voice breaking. Get him out of my studio! Ricky held up his hands, backing away. Don't worry, I'm going. I wouldn't stay on this joke of a show for another second anyway. He turned to the audience, that crowd of stunned faces, and gave them a little wave. Sorry you had to see that, folks. Turns out free speech only applies when you say things Graham Norton agrees with. That's not true, Graham shouted after him. You can say whatever you want, but I don't have to give you a platform for it. Ricky spun around, walking backward now toward the exit. That's literally what censorship is, Graham. You just described censorship. The two other guests were still frozen on the couch. One of the cameras panned to them, catching their shocked expressions. The young actress looked like she wanted to disappear. The musician had his hand over his mouth. Graham was breathing hard, his chest heaving. A producer ran onto the stage, trying to calm him down, but Graham waved him off. No, we're not cutting to commercial. Everyone needs to see this. Everyone needs to see what happens when someone uses comedy as an excuse to spread hate. Ricky stopped at the edge of the stage right before the curtain. He turned back one more time, and the camera caught the look on his face. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something else. Disappointment, maybe. Or pity. You know what the saddest part of this is, Graham? Ricky said, his voice carrying across the silent studio. You actually believe you're the good guy here. You actually think that shutting down discussion, attacking someone for their views, kicking them off your show, you think that makes you moral. But it doesn't. It makes you exactly what you accused me of being. A bully. Graham didn't respond. He just stood there, shaking, staring at Ricky with this mixture of fury and something that might have been shame. I've been doing comedy for over 30 years, Ricky continued. I've been booed off stage. I've been protested against. I've had people try to get me canceled more times than I can count. And you know what? I'm still here. Because comedy matters. Truth matters. And no amount of self-righteous hosts on cozy chat shows is going to change that. He paused, letting his words sink in. Good luck with the rest of your show, Graham. I'm sure your other guests will tell you exactly what you want to hear. And with that, Ricky Gervais walked off the stage. The camera followed him as he pushed through the curtain and disappeared backstage. For a few seconds, there was complete silence in the studio. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Graham seemed stunned by what had just happened. Then the producer rushed up to Graham, whispering urgently in his ear. Graham nodded, still looking shaken, and turned back to face the audience and cameras. We're going to take a quick break, he said, his voice hoarse. When we come back, we'll have music. But his hands were still shaking, and everyone watching could see it. This wasn't a polished TV moment. This was raw, real conflict, broadcast live to millions. The young actress on the couch started crying properly now, and the musician put an arm around her shoulders. The audience sat in their seats, some of them looking angry, some looking confused, others pulling out their phones to record what they'd just witnessed. Backstage, according to people who were there, Ricky walked straight to the exit without stopping. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't collect his things. He just left the building and got into his car. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were exploding across social media. Twitter was on fire. Instagram was flooded with reaction videos. TikTok was full of people taking sides. But back in the studio, Graham was left standing on his stage, in front of his cameras, trying to compose himself. He smoothed down his jacket, ran a hand through his hair, and took a deep breath. The producer gave him a thumbs up, indicating they were about to go live again after the commercial break. Graham sat back down in his chair. The other two guests shuffled awkwardly on the couch, clearly unsure what they were supposed to do. Should they leave? Should they stay? Should they acknowledge what just happened or pretend it didn't? When the cameras came back on, Graham's smile was back in place, but it didn't reach his eyes. Well, he said, his voice falsely bright, that certainly was unexpected. A few people in the audience laughed nervously. Most stayed silent. Let's move on, shall we? Graham continued. We have wonderful music coming up, and I promise no more drama. But everyone watching knew that wasn't true. The drama was just beginning. This confrontation would be talked about for weeks, maybe months. It would be analyzed, debated, turned into think pieces and hot takes. People would argue about who was right and who was wrong. They'd pick sides. They'd fight about it online and at dinner tables. And through it all, one thing was clear. What happened on Graham Norton's show last night wasn't just a celebrity spat. It was a collision of two different worldviews, two different ideas about what comedy should be, what free speech means, and where the line is between humor and harm. The young actress wiped her eyes and tried to smile. The musician stared at his hands. Graham took a sip of water, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the glass to his lips. Somewhere outside the studio, Ricky Gervais was probably already writing a tweet about what had happened. Or maybe he was silent, letting the footage speak for itself. Either way, he'd made his point. He'd walked away rather than be silenced, and he'd done it in the most public way possible. Back on stage, Graham cleared his throat and tried to move forward with the show, but the energy was gone. The magic that usually filled his studio had evaporated, replaced by this thick, uncomfortable tension that no amount of jokes or wine could fix. The other guests did their best. They told their stories, promoted their projects, laughed at Graham's questions, but it all felt hollow now, like everyone was just going through the motions, waiting for the show to end so they could escape. When the music act finally came on, there was a sense of relief in the studio. At least now they could stop talking, stop pretending everything was normal. The band played, and for a few minutes, everyone could just watch and listen and not think about the confrontation that had torn through the show like a tornado. But even as the music filled the studio, people were still processing what they'd seen. The audience members who'd witnessed it live would go home and tell everyone they knew. The footage would be replayed endlessly online. Comedians would comment on it. Journalists would write about it. It would become one of those moments that defined an era, a perfect encapsulation of the culture wars that were tearing through entertainment, media, and society. When the show finally ended, Graham thanked his guests and his audience with his usual charm. He smiled and waved as the credits rolled, but everyone who knew him could see the toll it had taken. His eyes were tired. His shoulders were slumped. This wasn't how tonight was supposed to go. As the studio lights dimmed and the audience filed out, people were already on their phones, watching the clips, sharing their opinions, arguing with strangers. Some thought Graham was a hero for standing up to Ricky. Others thought he was a hypocrite who couldn't handle disagreement. Some thought both of them were wrong. Others thought both were right. But one thing nobody could deny, they'd witnessed something extraordinary. A real, unscripted moment of conflict between two of Britain's biggest entertainment figures. No PR teams could spin it. No editors could cut it. It happened live, in front of millions. And now everyone had to grapple with what it meant. Ricky Gervais had walked off the Graham Norton show, and television would never be quite the same.